All right, so when I see a headline that says Canada as we know it will soon cease to exist, chances are I'm going to click, right? And when I saw this headline last week, I immediately assumed, oh, this has to do with the passport. They've removed the images from the passport. The country is doomed, right? But lo and behold, this had nothing to do with the passport. Canada as we know it will soon cease to exist. Here's the subheadline. The Trudeau government is not only complicit in this gradual slide towards a separate Quebec, it is actively supporting it with its changes to the Official Languages Act, Bill C-13. So Canada will soon cease to exist as we know it, and it has to do with language. I said, who's the author of this? And it's none other than Andrew Cadell, president of the Task Force on Linguistic Policy. Andrew, welcome to the studio.
Good morning, Alice. Great to be with you.
Listen, there's some bluster there, but it seems to me, after reading your piece, you truly believe this. The new Official Languages Act could spell doom for the country. Why?
Well, first of all, we have a situation where in a minority government, where in committee, the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives basically conspired to allow Bill 96 to be included in the new Official Languages Act. So in doing that, it throws everything that's in Bill 96, including the notwithstanding clause for search and seizure, all the elements of freedom of expression, all of those things under the bus. It puts them inside a federal law, which is unprecedented and quite dangerous. And therefore you have that. The other thing is that the Official Languages Act, as it used to be, was very balanced. It was called symmetrical bilingualism, where you had support for Anglophones in Quebec and you had support for Francophones outside Quebec. And I'm an advocate for Francophones outside Quebec, and I was actually involved in the legislation in Ontario called Bill 8, which was the French services law in the 1980s. So I have a record of being very, very actively involved in supporting Francophone rights outside Quebec. But what's happened is this bill gives all the good incentives and all the opportunities to Francophones outside Quebec to support French outside Quebec, and gives virtually nothing except money to Anglophones within. And they basically kowtowed and caved into François Roberge, who's the minister for the French language in Quebec. And last week there was a meeting, there was a chat between François Roberge and Ginette Petitpas-Taylor, who's the federal minister of official languages. And they were very, very, chummy, buddy, talking about how they're going to basically suppress language rights.
Quebec is getting everything they want.
Exactly.
So that's why they're chummy here, right?
Yeah.
So
it's basically like putting an arsonist in charge of the fire department.
Okay. So you mentioned right off the top, though, all conservatives and Bloc coming together, pushing through amendments.
Yes.
But your piece says that Justin Trudeau is the one who's responsible for this impending doom, right? So where do you, and you mentioned Ginette Petitpas-Taylor. This is a liberal bill. They could get rid of this bill anytime if they wanted to, right?
They could, but I think they've gone so far out on the ledge now that they cannot go back, first of all. Second of all, it's seen as being good for Francophones outside Quebec, and that's why people in minority communities outside are supporting it. And we really don't have anybody to speak for us, with one exception. I give him a huge amount of credit, Anthony Housefather, because he stood up, 311 votes, one abstention, he voted against.
And then there will be the actual big vote. When is it? Is it Tuesday?
It's coming up soon, yes.
It's coming up soon, right? And that's where it's actually...
third reading, yes.
Yeah, and that's where we will see if anyone else joins them within the liberal ranks.
Well, I kind of did it because they're being whipped and they're being told, I think your career is on the line if you want to have the Prime Minister sign your papers, because it's all about perception and political games. And they are so afraid of the CAQ in Quebec that there's no way that they're going to contradict what the CAQ wants. What the CAQ wants, they get.
So how does this impact national unity? Because some would argue Quebec getting what they want means it ensures they stay in Quebec and they stay in Canada and everyone's happy. Why does it mean the opposite?
Well, because first of all, in Bill 96 and now Bill C-13, Quebec is recognized as a nation, and Quebec is recognized as having only one official language, even though since 1867, Section 133 has said that there were two official languages in the legislatures and the courts, and that's being undermined as well. So if you don't have a constitution that's being respected, and you don't have people defending the constitution as per the oath that they took in Parliament, then essentially, do you have a country? And that's the question that I'm asking is, do we really have a country if we don't have a constitution? And I think Pierre Trudeau would be spinning in his grave if this was happening.
I would agree with you, but then we have his son who maybe would say something else. Now, we're with Andrew Cadell, president of the Task Force on Linguistic Policy. Andrew, sometimes I take it from our listeners here because and I've said this before, I'll say it right here. François Legault and the CAQ, they are doing what every Quebec government has always done, fight for Quebec. That hasn't changed. They're still fighting for Quebec. What's changed is that in Ottawa, there is no, Prime Minister should be François Legault for Canada, right? They should be nationalist for Canada. Now that no longer exists. So when I say, why things are changing in this country and language is changing? Because of a weak federal government, not because François Legault is strong. So do you, I know some of our listeners, they put all the hatred towards the provincial government and the CAQ. Where do you put it, though? Where do you think the blame should go? Should it go to Ottawa or Quebec City?
I think it should go to all of them because the Bloc Québécois does not give a damn, if I can say that, about Canada. And their objective is to destroy Canada. Meanwhile, you have Pierre Poilievre, who wants votes in Quebec and thinks that he's going to get Bloc Québécois votes. And you have Justin Trudeau, who has 35 seats or 36 seats in Quebec and wants to keep them and not allow the Bloc Québécois to get them. And so it's all about satisfying, appeasing the CAQ and appeasing the Bloc Québécois, even though nobody has ever won votes by pandering to Quebec. And the Conservatives and the NDP are just as much at fault.
So what changed? Because I do remember a time where the Prime Minister was a Liberal and came from Quebec, and his name was Jean Chrétien, and he stood up to Quebec all the time, right?
Of course.
So what do you think is going on in the current Liberal brain trust, for lack of a better term? What do you think is going on in their minds where they think this is the best approach?
They've made a political calculus that a party like the CAQ that has 99% support of François Legault, that they are defining, their extreme nationalist point of view is defining what Quebec wants.
Okay, but so you think it's politics on their end. You don't think that they actually have a stance like Ginette Petitpas-Taylor and the people in cabinet and the Liberals have a different idea of what Canada is and can be?
Well, if they do, it's certainly a perverse one, I think, because it goes completely against anything that ever existed before by saying that the minorities in Quebec are different from the minority in the rest of the country, the Francophone minority. You're actually creating two classes of people, and you're discriminating legally against the 1.25 million people who speak English in Quebec as their common language.
So when this bill passes, all indications are it will go through. When it does, then what?
Well, two things. The Senate will look at it. We have a brief. The task force has a brief before the Senate. I'm not sure if they're going to invite us because most of the members of the committee are francophones from outside Quebec, and so they're not really interested in hearing the point of view of anglophones, even though I've offered to do the entire presentation in French. Because I'm very much at home in French. The other thing that's possible is that we take it to court in the same way as the Blakey judgment in the Supreme Court went against Bill 101 in the 1970s. Yeah. And our group, the task force, is taking Bill 96 to court. And if anybody's interested, they can look up www.protectourrights.ca because we need money. We've already raised about $30,000, and we're going to raise more for our court challenge. But that's the only way. But it shouldn't be that we defend the Constitution in court. It should be our political leaders who took an oath to defend the Constitution that are defending it.
So when you look at that, where do you? And I know you mentioned Anthony Housefather, and he stands alone in that, but is there any other support anywhere in the political diaspora of Canada to your point on the damage that C-13 and Bill 96 does to the Constitution?
I say this with a certain amount of prudence, but I really worry that there are Anglophones in the rest of the country, and I would think about Blair Higgs or Blaine Higgs, whatever his name is, in New Brunswick, who want this because then they will say, no, Quebec is all French, we can be all English, and we don't have to kowtow to our Francophone minorities because the federal government's going to take care of them. So then you'll see provincial politicians coming forward in Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, maybe even Ontario, saying, we don't have to provide these services in French because, hey, federal government's already paying for this. And, we don't really have a big Francophone minority in our province. So, we're just going to do everything in English. And that will create a huge backlash against those Francophone minorities, or this bill will. It's a mess, and nobody's really thought it down the line what the consequences are.
Well, listen, I think some people like you are thinking about it, but I think there's a decision been made by the Liberal government that doesn't matter. Andrew, thanks so much for coming in the studio for this.
It's always a pleasure, Elias.
Andrew Cadell is president of the Task Force on Linguistic Policy. Wait, you need money for a legal thing? Where do I go for the money?
www.protectourrights.ca.
Protectourrights.ca. All right, typing it in. Thanks so much.